Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 9th of November, where we are going to be talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream. I also wanted to remind you that registration is beginning on the 9th, and you can access the course catalog online on our GCC website. I've also included the link below, and basically you will be able to see the classes that are offered not just for spring semester but also for intersession. That happens to be that January period when we don't normally hold classes, and you can complete an entire semester in 3.5 weeks. Obviously, it's incredibly condensed. Classes meet every day of the week, Monday through Friday, for several hours a day. I actually teach a class in that format, public speaking, and usually the classes are smaller and the students tend to be pretty dedicated to their work. I would think you would have to be with taking a class in that particular format. As you know, I am a horror film buff and I am teaching a class in horror film in the spring, and that's my CMN 201 media class about horror film and popular culture. And that would be on Wednesdays from 6 to 9:50. And if you are a Shakespeare fan, since we're talking about Shakespeare, I am teaching a class in Shakespeare, and that is on Mondays and Wednesdays from 8 to 9:15. But if you have any questions at all about the registration process, please don't hesitate to let me know. And you might also be interested to know that if you are very enthusiastic about literature and you wanted to devote most of your electives to taking literature classes, you could actually have a concentration in your degree with English. And I happen to be the advisor for that. You have to take 6 200 level English classes. But certainly, if you've got any questions or concerns about that particular program, you can contact me or basically anybody in the English department. So, in terms of where we are, I just also wanted to remind you that Thursday, our next class, we are not meeting because it is Veterans Day. So, what I wanted to try to do is to give you an overview of Midsummer Night's Dream, and then we can put some closure onto it the following week, and then finally have our last drama. At that point, we can also start talking about our journal about dramas and ultimately paper number 2, which will be about drama. But as you know, we've spent a good amount of time watching performance from Shakespeare's Globe Theater. And if you are still struggling with plot, one of the recommendations I have is that you look at that HBO special about Shakespeare's animated tales, specifically for Midsummer Night's Dream, but they've basically done many of Shakespeare's works. So in about a half hour or so, you can get a fairly decent overview. And the link is in section 3 of the notes below. But in terms of Midsummer, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the themes because I'm hopeful that at this point you have finished the play and you finished watching the performance so that you've got a fairly good understanding of what's happening in terms of plot. And as we know, comedies are about love and all of the complications associated about love. And one of the major themes is that love makes everyone, regardless of their age, regardless of their status, regardless of their gender, an idiot. Now, some of the statements Shakespeare makes about love are a little bit uncomfortable, but at least Shakespeare's equal opportunity. He mocks all of us, himself included, when it comes to love. Love can destroy friendships, and we see that with Helena and Hermia, who used to be best friends and basically become bitter enemies by Act 3, which is where we get the height of conflict. Love is like a spell, and basically you're no longer in control. And that is something that we see through Puck and putting the magic love juice as a spell on people's eyes. Love is like a dream. Notice the title of the play, Midsummer Night's Dream. A dream happens when we're asleep, when we're not conscious of what's going on, and we can't control it. And if things go badly, it could even be a nightmare. And all of those elements about love don't necessarily negate the comedic aspects of the play, but Shakespeare is giving us a little bit more complexity than just giving us comedy. So One of the things that I think that's interesting about A Midsummer Night's Dream is, for instance, the title. And not only are dreams important in terms of understanding this play, but knowing a little bit about midsummer as well. And midsummer is a pagan holiday, and it basically is celebrated to start the summer equinox, the beginning of the season of growth, renewal, and rebirth. And the way that it's celebrated is that individuals will dance around a maypole. Perhaps you are familiar with this activity from, let's say, something like elementary school. What they don't talk about in elementary school are all of the sexual connotations associated with midsummer. That because midsummer is supposed to be about rebirth, the way to celebrate midsummer is through fertility rituals. And the maypole is supposed to represent the phallus or the penis. So when people are dancing around the maypole, they basically are celebrating the idea of sexuality. Again, probably something that you don't necessarily talk about at that level, the elementary school level at least. And the idea that it happens at night, and we've already talked about the times of the days, and night usually indicates a descent or some sort of a transition. Obviously, they're under the cover of darkness. So even though sexual purity was highly, highly embraced by the Renaissance society, especially for female, is an entire subtext in this play about sexual union, which goes to show some of the ways that Shakespeare upsets expectations and even is somewhat subversive in some of his arguments. Beauty, for instance, at the time it was considered to be the epitome of beauty if a female was tall and blonde. In other words, much like Helena, not like Hermia, who is the short brunette. But notice that at the beginning of the play, the short brunette is the one that has both men who are interested in her, not the tall blonde. That females can defy powerful male figures. We see that right at the very beginning of the play when we are introduced to our characters, when Hermia dares to defy her father. I mean, a daughter would be seen as basically a father's property to do with as he will. And he has basically made a determination that she is going to be with Demetrius, and she dares to say no. And it's important that both Demetrius and Lysander are very similar. I know that oftentimes readers are trying to find some difference between them, perhaps in terms of status, but they really aren't. And that goes to show the power of the father, that there really is no rationale. Or if anybody in a power situation has ever told you when you ask or perhaps when you challenge them about something, they say, because I told you so. That's basically what's happening with Hermia's father. He doesn't need a rationale. Basically, as the father, he gets to decide, and the fact that she would try to defy his will. But of course, we see how Shakespeare can even subvert that, because at the very beginning of the play, we have Theseus and Hippolyta, and Theseus has basically conquered Hippolyta in war. Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons, very strong female warrior culture. So basically, in this instance, we see power struggles and how the male has basically conquered the female. Now, this is supposed to be a comedy, so that while at the beginning they may not necessarily, or at least Hippolyta may not necessarily be too happy about that union, by the ending of the play, the assumption is that she doesn't much mind. This kind of political union would have been very common during the time period, where people would marry for status or for position or for wealth, not necessarily for romance. That affection would develop after marriage, not before marriage, which again goes to show how unusual Helena's relationship is. And if we also think about Helena, the idea that Helena was once with Demetrius. So that indicates that at one point he made some sort of a pledge to her, but he's changed his mind, illustrating the fickle nature of love, and also illustrating unrequited love, because while he has changed his mind, Helena has not changed her mind as she continues to pursue him. This is also somewhat problematic if you're trying to look for strong females in the play, because Helena is basically, I guess a modern day term would be a stalker. And she throws herself at Demetrius saying, treat me like your dog, your spaniel. That said, during the time of the Renaissance, it would have seemed very unusual for a woman to take on the role of pursuer. And Helena even acknowledges that women were made to woo, or women were made to be wooed, not to woo. So in that way, perhaps she could be seen as a strong female. And by the ending of the play, she gets what she wants and Hermia gets what she wants. So in some ways, you can say that Shakespeare is arguing about the feminine and the strength of feminine. Now, of course, once we start getting to the fairy kingdom, which illustrates that even if you are above human beings, as fairies would seem to be because of their magical powers, you are still subject to all of the nonsense associated with love. And we see that with Oberon and Titania, and they're both arguing over a changeling child. And again, we see the power struggle between them. As husband, basically, Titania should listen to her husband's will. She refuses. This changeling child, she feels, has a connection to her because one of her serving women died in birth, giving birth to this child, so she's rearing it. We assume that Oberon is much like Aegeus is with Hermia. The because I said so argument. This is why you should be doing what I say. Though it could also be because he feels a little bit of jealousy, perhaps, in that his wife is paying more attention to this changeling boy rather than paying attention to him. And we know that at this point, we've got a very strong female. Basically, Titania defies her husband. But what ends up happening by the ending of the play is that Oberon ends up getting that changeling child, and Titania is humiliated. So again, I don't know necessarily what that says about strength of female. But as you can see, there are a lot of themes that are quite complex in terms of Shakespeare. And one piece of trivia that is important is that the donkey or the ass, and of course Bottom is a literal ass because he acts like an idiot, but he's also turned into an ass by Puck. But the donkey or the ass as an animal was thought to be the most well-endowed creature in the animal kingdom. So again, lots of sexual body humor going on here when Titania ends up falling in love with, of all people, Bottom. He's so beneath her social scale. Again, this is Shakespeare's commentary about how love is blind. But also the idea that there is some sort of a sexual connection going on between the two, which I think we see illustrated in the Globe production where they try to play that up, but the Globe production was made really for adults. Some of the things to also consider with Shakespeare, outside of the complexity of the themes, it happens to do with the writing, and that's probably where Shakespeare shines and why he's earned the reputation that he has. As we see throughout the play, the characters oftentimes speak in rhyme. Rhyme is supposed to be a higher level form of language, so rhyme should be something that would be reserved for the upper classes. However, Shakespeare will subvert that as well by sometimes having the lower classes speak in rhyme to illustrate that you don't necessarily have to be of a particular class or educational status in order to use lofty language. The opposite can happen as well, because we oftentimes have characters who are speaking in prose, complete sentences, rather than verse, which happens to be poetry. And if that's the case, then you can assume that if a character is speaking in prose, they're a lower level character because they're speaking in complete sentences. But Shakespeare will subvert that as well by having some of the higher level characters descend from speaking from poetry and speaking from rhyme and basically descend into prose. Not everything in Shakespeare is rhyme. Shakespeare is known for writing an iambic pentameter. That is a 10-syllable line, and it sounds like bum 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 bum, almost like a heartbeat. And in fact, some scholars have done some studies about that, saying that it's one of the reasons why that rhythm is so attractive to us, because it's the rhythm that we first heard within the womb, and one of the reasons why Shakespeare's language can be so appealing. We'll talk a little bit more about iambic pentameter, rhymed and unrhymed, when we get to Shakespeare's poetry, specifically in the poetry section. But I thought I would talk a little bit about each act at this point and sort of review some of the pieces that I wanted you to consider. And in the first act, we're immediately introduced to a good amount of wit. We should expect Shakespeare's plays to be quite witty. This happens with Lysander, and you can see that I have this in section 6 of our notes, where Lysander is basically indicating to Demetrius, well, you have her father's love, Demetrius. Let me have Hermias. Yeah, so nice amount of wit there. The history of what happened prior to the play were given when Lysander basically indicates that Demetrius had made love to Neater's daughter, Helena. And made love doesn't necessarily mean that they have consummated their relationship. That means that there was just wooing that went on, a romance. Again, if during the Renaissance, a woman needed to remain pure until marriage, or else she would be seen as damaged goods. The moral of the play comes several times throughout the course of the play, but right at the very beginning, this is in Act 1, Scene 1, line 134. So we're not very far into the play at all, where basically Lysander says the course of true love never did run smooth. And we definitely see that in this play, that love has its ups and its downs. Now, Hermia and her rhyme is something that I wanted to contrast with Bottom and his rhyme. And one example right in the first act is Act 1, Scene 1, line 202 to 207. And notice when we're talking about Shakespeare, we don't have to refer to page numbers because the plays are divided up by act, scene, and line. So in the parentheses after a quote, instead of putting the page number, you can indicate the act with a period, the scene with a period, and the line, much like I've done in the notes below. And this is just a very short speech of Hermias, but I wanted to show how Shakespeare was able to use rhyme so effortlessly and still be able to forward plot, which is not an easy thing to do. And Hermias says, "Take comfort, he no more shall see my face. Lysander and myself will fly this place. Before the time I did Lysander see, seemed Athens as a paradise to me. Oh, then, what graces in my love do dwell, that he hath turned a heaven unto a hell." Now remember, Bottom and his cohorts are rehearsing a play, very aptly, about love and love gone badly, Pyramus and Thisbe. And when he's rehearsing the play, he's actually reciting some lines that rhyme. But this is an example of bad rhyme. Act 1, Scene 2, line 31 through 38. And what Bottom says when he's in character in Pyramus and Thisbe, "The raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus' car shall shine from far, and make and mar the foolish fates." And that's absolutely ridiculous because he's not saying much of anything. Yes, it rhymes, but it's nonsense. It's almost like roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. What's even worse is what he says after that. He says, that was lofty. In other words, he praises himself, but we know that Bottom is quite filled with arrogance and self-centeredness. So as we move forward to Act 2, and remember I had suggested that Shakespearean plays have a kind of pyramid structure, where at the bottom of the pyramid on the left-hand side, that would be Act 1, where we are introduced to characters and conflicts. And notice that we are introduced to characters from different stations of life, all the way from the fairies, who would be at the top, to all the way at the bottom, which we would have Bottom. And as well, we are introduced to basically different stages of relationship. So we've got the old married couple, if you will, with the fairies, Oberon and Titania, and they're in the midst of arguments. We've got individuals who are on the cusp of getting married. In other words, they're engaged. And that would be at the beginning of the play, Theseus and Hippolyta. And then we've got individuals who are courting, and that would be basically the Lysander, Demetrius, Helena, Hermia. You probably noticed, and I think I noted it as well, that the same actors in the Globe performance who play Theseus and Hippolyta are also playing Oberon and Titania. That was a very deliberate choice. Sometimes that was done in Shakespeare's time just in terms of economic concerns. If there was an actor who could do a dual role, well, it made sense to have that one actor play both roles and pay just one salary. But I think it was a great choice from the director that they decided, or the director decided, to have the same actors play these two couples, because there's so many similarities between Theseus and Hippolyta and Oberon and Titania, and this idea of power struggles within relationship, man trying to exert power over female. So, but if we were to move to Act 2, we would be moving up the side of that pyramid. So now the conflict is beginning to build. And we see the power dynamics. In fact, when Titania says to Oberon, not only is she not going to give up that changeling, but she has forsworn his bed and his company. In other words, she's denying him sexual relations in order to exert her power over him. That's in Act 2, Scene 1, line 63. Now, of course, dramas at the time that they would have been performed during during the Shakespearean era, needed to have some somewhat unusual conventions. So, for instance, in Act 2, Scene 1, line 186, Oberon at one point says, "I am invisible," which seems to be an odd statement unless we think about the fact of a Renaissance audience watching this and and they're needing to be told that Oberon the fairy is invisible, so that when the other characters are on stage, they can't see Oberon. So this is for us to understand that he's just become invisible. Remember, no Steven Spielberg with special effects during this particular time period. And then the threats. This play can get pretty dark. Even in the second act, Act 2, Scene 1, line 236 or 237. This is where Demetrius and Helena are arguing. Helena has basically told Demetrius that Hermia is running off to the woods with her love, thinking that Demetrius will be so grateful that he will now love Helena, which goes to show how irrational love is, because this isn't logical at all, her thinking. But what Demetrius says to her is, "If you follow me going into the woods, or if thou follow me, but I shall do thee mischief in the wood." Basically, what he's saying is that if she continues to pursue him, he is going to take her virginity. Again, that is her most valuable asset as a single female in the time of the Renaissance. Of course, this is a comedy, so we know that nothing like that could ever occur. And Helena talks about, as I was referencing earlier, about gender when she laments that, and this is in Act 2, Scene 1, line 240 to 242, "Your wrongs do set a scandal on my sex. We cannot fight for love as men may do. We should be wooed, and we're not made to woo." So if you want to see any kind of strength in Helena, it would be the fact that she acts as pursuer and basically she's successful. Though again, as I had indicated, it's very difficult to see her as a strong female, particularly in modern day context. Hermia, however, is a strong female. She defies her father. And one of the questions might be, why is it that when her father, Aegeus, goes to the highest law of the land, basically to have Theseus declare to Hermia, "You better listen to Dad and do what he says," Theseus decides to offer Hermia time to think about things. If she makes the wrong decision, defies her father, it'll be either a nunnery or death, and both would be considered equally horrible. But why give her time to think about things? Well, part of it is the practical element. I mean, Shakespeare needs to have time to get everybody into the woods one way or the other. And there also is, I think, a thematic reason, a plot reason for this, and that obviously Theseus is having his own love difficulties, and perhaps he feels a little bit of empathy for Hermia, who is having some of her love difficulties. But regardless, he decides to give her some time to think about things, which gives her time to run away into the woods. And talk about timeless and universal themes. The idea of two kids fall in love and the family doesn't approve. That story is as old as time itself. So when we continue on with Act 2 and the beginning of the rising of tension, Hermia, I think, very much illustrates the importance of modesty and chastity and virginity for female. In Act 2, Scene 2, line 57, where basically she tells Lysander, remember they've run away, and he wants to lie next to her in the woods, in the dark, in midsummer. And again, think about all of the sexual possibilities here. And she says, for love and courtesy lie further off in human modesty. In other words, she doesn't want to be tempted, and she doesn't want him to be tempted to have physicality. So, because they're supposed to remain chaste until marriage, especially the female. That's not to stop the men from trying. And when we think about the fact that Shakespeare and his wife, Anne Hathaway, had their first child 6 months after they were married, I guess you can see that just because chastity was something that was condoned and supported, it wasn't necessarily something that was practiced. When we get to Act 3, that's the tip of the pyramid, so to speak, and that's where we're going to get the height of tension. And things could go very badly here in Act 3, but we know that we have a comedy, so we have to have a happy ending, so there will be some resolution. But if this were a tragedy, basically we would have murders going on and deaths. Lots of morals in Act 3 come out. For instance, Bottom, of all people, has enough, I guess, self-awareness to say, and this is in Act 3, Scene 2, line 143 to 144. Reason and love keep little company. Reason and love keep little company, which is true. And basically, during times of love, it's very difficult to be reasonable and rational. Another moral comes from Puck. And Puck says, and this is Act 3, Scene 2, line 115, what fools these mortals be. Though, of course, we see that the fairies can be foolish as well. Now, Puck is a very interesting character. Usually actors say that he's the character they want to play. I personally was not a big fan of the actor who played Puck in the Globe version of the play that we saw. I think he was a little bit too sarcastic. But nevertheless, I've seen Puck played in a lot of different ways, all different ages, from child to middle-aged man, everything in between, different genders, male, female, sometimes, ambiguous. So in some ways, Puck is kind of like a Peter Pan character, and also like a Cupid character. But one of the interesting things about Puck is that he's supposed to be Oberon's servant, and yet Puck is the one who makes things happen. And again, I think that's an interesting comment about Shakespeare in class, and I see this sometimes in the workplace when the boss is perhaps not present. Business continues on, but when the administrative assistant is not present, business comes to a halt. And that basically it's the person who's considered to be the assistant that is running the show. And Puck is a mischievous spirit. It also goes by the name of Robin Goodfellow. And he's supposed to be responsible for the frustrations that occur to all of us on our daily lives. So if you happen to trip but not hurt yourself when you're falling, you just merely embarrass yourself. Or when your milk curdles, for instance, and rather than before you can drink it. All of those are supposed to be the actions of a Puck. And Puck basically takes great delight in acting on his own by making Bottom into a donkey or an ass, because Bottom is a donkey or an ass. Now, Puck has been given instructions, but unfortunately the instructions can be interpreted two ways. Puck is told by Oberon, put the love juice on the eyes of the man wearing the Athenian garb. And what is supposed to be happening is that Puck is supposed to be putting the love juice onto Demetrius's eyes so that he falls in love with Helena. And Puck instead puts the love juice on Lysander's eyes. So he wakes up and sees Helena and he's in love. So that's a problem. And then in trying to rectify the mistake, things get even worse because the first mistake is not undone. So now we have both Demetrius and Lysander with love juice in love with Helena, and no one is in love with Hermia, which is the exact opposite of how the play began. And we could say that Puck did this deliberately, that he knew what he was doing, but he just wanted to create chaos. Or we could say that Puck was innocent and he just followed orders, and it was a terrible mistake. This is one of the great ways that an actor can put their own spin along with the director on Puck, whether or not this seems to be deliberate or whether or not it seems to be accidental. But regardless, Puck is having great joy in the consequences because he is very mischievous. And, of course, Oberon wanted Puck to put the love juice on Titania's eyes so that she falls in love with the first thing she sees. The idea is that when we are in love, we become distracted, and that which used to be important to us, such as changeling boys, no longer is important to us, which is exactly what happens in that when she's in love, Oberon is able to take the changeling boy. And what a happy coincidence that the first thing she sees when she opens her eyes is Bottom, the ass. Literally and figuratively. Not only is he a laborer all the way down in the social scale, but he literally is a beast. And again, as the most well-endowed beast in the animal kingdom, you can see how there are some interesting sexual suggestions going on here. So, as we continue on with Act 3, we see how the lovers become bitter enemies and the insults are flying, and some of the insults may not necessarily be that obvious in our contemporary language. So one insult, for instance, it's Helena saying to Hermia, "You puppet," and that's in Act 3, Scene 2, line 288. Puppet is something that is controlled by someone else, and a puppet is also small. This is a height joke because Hermia is short. Hermia responds to Helena in Act 3, Scene 2, line 296, "You painted maypole." Maypole, remember, is supposed to be a phallic symbol, so she just basically is called her former best friend a phallus. Painted is in reference to makeup, and the idea that makeup would be used in order to trick the opposite sex into romance. In other words, that this is what strumpets do, harlots do, they wear makeup. So painted maypole is a particularly nasty insult. Another insult is "Get away, you Ethiop." And this is in Act 3, Scene 2, line 258. Ethiop being Ethiopia, and that's in reference to Hermia's dark hair, not necessarily skin, but she's a brunette. And again, during the time of the Renaissance, tall and blonde was considered to be the mark of beauty. You can decide if that's still the case in our contemporary times. Not short and brunette. And Lysander, now remember, he used to adore Hermia. He says one of his first responses in Act 3, Scene 2, line 268 to 269, "Should I hurt her, strike her, kill her dead?" I mean, his first go-to response is that, well, he's going to kill her, but since he can't kill her instead, he's going to insult her. And he says things like in Act 3, Scene 2, line 327 to 329, "Get you gone, you dwarf, you minimus, you bead, you acorn." And all of these are height insults. Dwarf, minimus, supposed to be small. Bead is small. Acorn is small. So that gives you an idea about some of the ways that in Act 3 we see some rather dark things occurring. But we know that we have to have a resolution, and that's going to be in Act 4. And basically when Puck rectifies his mistakes, and then basically keeps the love juice on Demetrius so that he loves Helena, which could be seen as not necessarily a positive ending because Demetrius is manipulated into loving Helena, but it could also be seen as a positive in the sense that Demetrius had basically pledged himself to Helena prior to the plague. So perhaps this is a restoration of order. But since we've got all four lovers, Helena, Hermia, Demetrius, and Lysander, all content with their couplings, basically Theseus makes a resolution and that he's not going to do anything. And in fact, he says in Act 4, Scene 1, line 179, "Aegeus, I will overbear your will." So basically, Aegeus is the only one who doesn't get his way. And of course, Bottom is returned back to his human form. He says, rather ironically, Act 4, Scene 1, line 206, "Man is but an ass." And of course, he was just an ass. But again, truth. He is able to see what perhaps the others don't. Reason and love keep little company nowadays. And that man, humanity, especially when in love, are basically asses. Now, Shakespeare would take opportunities to be able to complement those in political power, as I had talked a little bit about earlier in regards to Shakespearean plays. They were seen as rather lowbrow, but luckily for Shakespeare, and all dramas were seen as kind of lowbrow. But luckily for Shakespeare and other dramatists of the time, the monarch in power, Queen Elizabeth, enjoyed going to the plays. So that's one of the reasons why the plays survive, is because they had her political support. However, being able to give a compliment to the politicians in power, if possible, is never a bad move. And we see how Shakespeare does this in Act 4, Scene 1, line 93 through 100. You might have missed this. This is where basically you've got Theseus and Hippolyta talking to one another about how they are going to be watching the play within a play from Bottom. And one of the things that they're talking about is that sometimes individuals are too nervous to give them proper greetings as king and queen. And this is the response that in Act 4, Scene 1, line 93 to 100, that's read as a tribute to the queen herself. When Theseus and Hippolyta are speaking, and Theseus says, "Where I've come, great clerks have proposed to greet me with premeditated welcomes, shiver and look pale, in conclusion dumbly broken off. Yet I picked a welcome." In other words, what they're saying there is that he, as a generous ruler, understands that people can be quite anxious in the face of royalty, and that if they don't necessarily give a proper greeting, it's not an act of disrespect. It's actually a sign of respect because they think so highly of the king and the queen. And the assumption is that Shakespeare is saying, that's you, Queen Elizabeth, who would be in the audience watching this. You also are very gracious in that respect. And then we get to Act 5, which would seem to not be necessary because everything has been resolved, but the play within a play is a typical Shakespearean technique in order to be able to be very meta, to remind us that we are watching a play. The play within a play is also about love. This time it's about love gone badly because the characters die. It's very much like a play you've probably heard of before, Romeo and Juliet, where the two lovers end up dead at the end. It also is a ridiculous play. I liken it to an elementary school production with bad acting and bad writing, and it's supposed to be that way. Shakespeare is doing that deliberately. Now, Hippolyta says at one point, Act 5, Scene 1, line 210, this is the silliest stuff I ever heard, and it is ridiculous and silly. Think about how little insight she has in the sense that she was equally silly. All of the humans were equally silly when they were having love problems earlier on in the play. And the statement, though, is really for us as audience, that if we laugh at the silliness we're seeing and we don't stop to think about how ridiculous we have been ourselves in love, then we are missing the point of the play. And it's also Shakespeare being a very clever businessman and basically showing us what we would see if we went to a drama written by another playwright. We would see something like Pyramus and Thisbe, something that is poorly written and poorly acted. So don't spend your time with that nonsense when you could be seeing the greatness of Shakespeare, is basically what's embedded in that. As well as just some grand old humor. And you know that comedies need to have humor. There is also the opportunity for bawdiness. Act 5, Scene 1, line 190 to 191. This is where Thisbe is speaking through the wall to Pyramus, saying, "My cherry lips have often kissed thy stones with lime and hair." And the way that line is read by scholars is that my cherry lips have kissed thy stones being testicles, and thy stones with lime and hair, that's in reference to pubic hair. In other words, this is a reference to oral sex. And I think we saw a little bit of this when we saw the Globe production as well, where they were taking some liberties with some physical humor for some sexual innuendo. And then the ending speech of the drama by Puck. And this is considered to be perhaps one of Shakespeare's most famous scenes and speeches, where Puck says, "If we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here." And it's such a wonderful speech because not only is it beautiful, But it also is Shakespeare, the businessman, basically saying, the play's over, you can applaud now. Give me your hands if we be friends. In other words, give me your hands, applaud. And they want applaud. And they want to escape the serpent's tongue, the booing and the hissing, basically, that would happen in an audience if they were unhappy with what they saw. And our audiences could be pretty rowdy. They could actually throw rotten food onto the stage if they didn't like what they saw. So this is basically Shakespeare through the guise of Puck, basically saying the play is over. Actually, this is Shakespeare through the actor through the guise of Puck. So there's 3 levels here. All 3 saying play's over. Hope you liked it. Please applaud. If you didn't like it, remember it was all a dream. Don't take it all so seriously. But even embedded within that particular speech, there's some subversion because Puck says, if I were an honest Puck. Thing is, Puck's not honest. We know this. He has established a reputation for being dishonest. So how sincere is this last speech about being sorry if anybody was offended? But that's Shakespeare's wink and a nod for you. So, as I said, I'm not done with the Midsummer Night's Dream. I will put closure onto it next class, which will not be on Thursday because we've got Veterans Day. That'll be next week, and then we will end our drama section with The Raisin in the Sun. And today's attendance question, which is going to be due on our class discussion forum on Wednesday, the 10th, at 10 a.m. And if you need an extension, just let me know. What did you find to be the most surprising thing about the play A Midsummer Night's Dream, and why? What did you find to be the most surprising thing about the play A Midsummer Night's Dream, and why? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next week. Take care. Bye-bye.